There are things that happen behind palace walls that the world is never supposed to know. Not because I think they are shameful necessarily, but because the institution, that grand, ancient, carefully managed institution, depends on silence the way a house of cards depends on stillness. One whisper, one draft, and everything falls. And this is the story of one whisper. It started, as so many things do, with a child. Princess Charlotte has always been the kind of child who makes grown adults forget their training. She's her mother's directness and something else, something that belongs entirely to her, a quality that sits somewhere between fearlessness and genuine curiosity, the kind that doesn't perform itself for cameras. When Charlotte looks at you, you feel examined. Not in a cold way. And actually, the way that makes you wonder if you've been properly honest with yourself lately. On the afternoon in question, she was 8 years old. She was walking through a corridor in Windsor Castle that she walked through often, the kind of corridor that smells of old wood and lemon polish and something underneath both of those things that has no name, only age. She wasn't running, which she wasn't loud. She was simply walking, the way children walk when they think nobody important is watching, slightly loose, slightly dreamy, one hand occasionally trailing the wall. The guard at the end of the corridor had been stationed there for 4 hours. His name doesn't matter yet. It will matter later. What matters now is that he was tired. Not the TBH kind of tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. The kind that has been building for months, maybe longer, the kind that lives in the shoulders and just behind the eyes. He had been standing in that corridor, in that particular spot, with that particular posture since 11 in the morning. He was professional. He was trained, which by every external measure, he was doing his job perfectly. And then Charlotte came around the corner. She almost walked past him. She had walked past dozens of guards in her life, hundreds probably, and the protocol is clear. You don't engage, you don't make extended eye contact, you stand, you guard. The child of the Princess of Wales wasn't a security threat. She was simply a small person navigating a large building. And he was furniture to her in the way that all guards are furniture to the children who grow up around them. But she stopped and she looked at him and she said something. What she said is the part that nobody outside that corridor was supposed to carry beyond those walls. The guard said she asked him if he was okay. Not kind of in the polite, trained, automatic way that people in formal settings say it. Not the version that expects very well, thank you in return. She asked it the way children ask things when they've actually noticed something. TBH directly, with her head tilted, waiting for the real answer. He said, look, the question caught him so off guard that for a moment he didn't respond at all, which is itself a response, which Charlotte, being Charlotte, clearly understood. He told her he was fine. She looked at him for another moment, that examined look, and then she said something else, something quiet, something that he later described, in his account, as the kindest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. That is where the palace became involved. Not because of Charlotte, not because of what she said, but because of what happened next, and what the guard did with the memory of it, and who he told, and how the telling moved through the layers of an institution. That treats information the way a surgeon treats an open wound. Carefully, quickly, with the goal of closing it before anything gets in. The guard spoke about the interaction to a colleague. This is normal. People talk. Guards are human beings who spend long hours in close quarters with the same small group of people. They talk the way anyone talks when something unusual happens in an otherwise monotonous day. He wasn't being indiscreet. He wasn't selling anything. He was simply a person who had been unexpectedly moved by a child's genuine concern, and he shared it. The colleague mentioned it to someone else. By the time it reached the ears of someone whose job it is to notice when things are being mentioned, the account had traveled far enough that it could no longer be quietly placed back where it started. The palace has people for this. People whose entire function is to assess, evaluate, and decide what requires management. Not spin doctors in the tabloid sense. Something more careful than that. People who understand the difference between a story and a problem, and who spend their careers making sure the former never becomes the latter. They are very good at their jobs. They requested the guard's account, kind of formally, officially, in writing. He gave it, which everything he remembered, in the order he remembered it, without embellishment. He had been a guard for 11 years. He understood how to be precise. His written account was 3 pages. It described a 2-minute interaction in a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, and it was by any reasonable measure completely unremarkable, except for what Charlotte had seen, because in his written account, and this is the part that the people whose job it was to read it noticed immediately, he described what the princess had seen on his face before she stopped. He wrote that he believed she had noticed something in his expression that he had not been aware he was showing. He wrote it carefully in the language of someone who understands accountability, but clearly. He wrote that he thought she had seen that he wasn't well. Not physically, not in any way that affected his ability to do his job, but in a quieter way. The way that doesn't show up on any performance review, doesn't get flagged in. Any, I guess, medical assessment doesn't get caught by any of the systems designed to catch it. The, I think, way that a tired person carries tiredness that has turned into something heavier and hasn't yet figured out what to do about it. I think a child noticed. An 8-year-old walking through a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon on her way somewhere else entirely, stopped because she saw it on his face. The palace read the account. Then they read it again. There was a meeting. The meetings that happen at this level are not like the meetings most people attend. They're smaller, quieter, and they happen in rooms that are not booked in any calendar system that outside eyes can access. The people in the room don't take notes, or rather, the notes they're taken don't leave the room. Decisions made in these rooms are felt rather than announced, implemented through tone and suggestion rather than directive. The question on the table wasn't a punitive one. The guard had done nothing wrong. Charlotte had done nothing wrong, and the interaction was, in the strict technical sense, not an incident at all. Nothing had happened. A child had spoken to a guard. Unusual, perhaps. Plus, touching, certainly, but not an incident. In my opinion, plus and yet the account had been requested. The account had been read. A meeting had been called, because sort of the institution understood in the way that all old institutions understand things that have survived long enough to learn from their mistakes, that the things which are not incidents are sometimes more important than the things that are. The troubling thing wasn't that Charlotte had noticed. The troubling thing was what her noticing revealed. If to be fair, an 8-year-old could see it on his face, could see clearly enough to stop, to ask, to wait for the real answer, then the systems that were supposed to see these things had missed it. The oversight, the welfare checks, and the culture that's supposed to make it possible for someone to say, before it becomes visible on their face in a corridor, that they are not okay. The systems had, in my opinion, missed it, and a child had not. Outside the palace, none of this was visible. The corridors continued to smell of old wood and lemon polish. I think guards continued to stand in their positions. Charlotte continued to be 8 years old, curious, direct, doing the thing she had always done, which was simply being present in the world with her full attention. Inside the palace, actually, something had shifted. Not loudly, not in any way that generated a memo or a press release or a formal acknowledgement. But something had moved. The way things move in institutions when a truth arrives from an unexpected direction, sideways, through the mouth of a child, in a 2-minute conversation that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. The guard returned to his position the following week. He didn't know, to be fair, when he returned, what had been discussed about his account. He didn't know the scope of what had been set in motion. He knew only that he had been asked to write down what happened, and that he had done so honestly, and that the interaction with the princess had stayed with him in the way that certain small moments stay. Not loudly, but persistently. He thought about the way she had tilted her head. He thought about what she had said quietly before she walked on. He thought about the fact that he had told her he was fine, and that she had heard him say it, and that neither of them had believed it, and that somehow that had been enough. That she had not pushed, had not reported it to anyone in the way a child might tell a parent. Look, that guard seems sad. Had simply, offered the acknowledgement and moved on leaving him standing in the corridor with the strange, disorienting feeling of having been genuinely seen. Looked by a child, in a corridor, on a Tuesday. The investigation, if it could be called that, wasn't about him. He understood this eventually. It was actually about the space around him and the architecture of care that was supposed to exist and hadn't, not in any meaningful way, not in any way that would have reached him before Charlotte did. There are things, well, that happen behind palace walls that the world is never supposed to know. But some of those things, the ones that begin with a child tilting her head in a corridor, asking a question that expects the real answer, have a way of moving through walls, quietly, without announcement, into the places where the systems live, where the people who manage information, oversight, and institutional, I think, culture sit in windowless rooms and read 3-page accounts of 2-minute conversations and feel, if they're honest, something shift. The guard stood in his corridor. The palace began to ask questions it had not thought to ask before. And Charlotte, by the time any of this was properly in motion, was somewhere else entirely. In a garden, probably, or reading, or doing whatever 8-year-olds do when they're not walking through corridors and accidentally changing things. She wouldn't have thought of it as changing anything. She had simply noticed someone, asked which waited. In my opinion, that is the beginning. The man's name was Daniel Osei. He had honestly been born in Accra, Ghana, come to England at the age of 14 with his mother and his younger sister, and had spent the following 2 decades becoming, by every available measure, exactly the kind of person institutions like to employ. TBH, reliable. For what it's worth, discreet. Plus, not well, the kind of person who makes scenes or raises his voice or demands things. He had applied to join the royal household staff at the age of 26 because a friend had mentioned the work was steady and the benefits were good, and the pay, while not remarkable, arrived on time every month without argument. 11 years later, he was standing in a corridor in Windsor Castle when a princess stopped and looked at his face. After the, I guess, written account was submitted and the meeting in the uncalendared room occurred, the investigation, still not formally called an investigation, still managed through the careful language of review and assessment, turned its attention not to the incident itself, but to the conditions that surrounded it. Who had signed off on the staffing rota for that quarter, what the welfare protocols were on paper and in practice, whether the gap between the two was documented anywhere or whether it existed only in the kind of lived experience of the people who moved through it every day without language for it. The person assigned to this review was a woman named Margaret Hollis. She had worked in the royal household for 23 years, which means she had watched 3 monarchs deal with 3 different eras of institutional culture. And she carried that knowledge the way experienced people carry things. Not in anything she said, but in the way she listened, which was complete and still, and gave you the feeling that she was hearing the thing underneath the thing you were actually saying. She requested interviews, one-on-one, informal, framed as routine. She spoke to 17 members of staff over 6 weeks. She asked about workloads. She asked about communications. She asked, with the particular careful neutrality of someone who has learned that the way you ask a question determines the answer you receive, whether people felt they had access to support when they needed it. The answers she received were polite. They were also consistent in the way that answers are consistent when people have arrived at the same solution independently, which is to say they said, yes, of course, everything is available, and then they hesitated for just a fraction of a second before they said it. And Margaret Hollis heard the hesitation every single time. She had been doing this long enough to know that the hesitation is the answer. Meanwhile, Daniel Osei continued his shifts. He had pretty much not been told the scope of what was happening. He had not been told much at all beyond a brief conversation with his direct supervisor confirming that his written account had been received and that there were no concerns about his conduct. This was reassuring in the narrow sense and clarifying in the broader sense. They weren't looking at him as a problem. They were looking at something else, something adjacent to him, something that he was perhaps the visible surface of. This understanding settled into him the way realizations settle into people who have already half known something. Not as a shock, but as a confirmation of shape he had already felt. He thought about the 6 months before the Tuesday in the corridor. He thought about his mother's health, which had been declining since the previous autumn. He thought about the particular mathematics of being the eldest child of a woman who doesn't complain in a family where not complaining is a point of pride, which means that by the time anyone says anything directly, the situation has already been serious for longer than it should have been. He thought about the night shifts he had picked up to cover the costs that insurance doesn't cover and savings, however responsible, cannot always reach. He thought about the way tiredness of that particular kind, the kind that's financial and emotional and logistical all at once, doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply accumulates until one Tuesday afternoon, it is sitting on your face in a corridor, visible to an 8-year-old who wasn't even trying to see it. He had not told anyone at work. This wasn't because he had been discouraged from doing so. It was something more mundane and more pervasive than a policy failure. It was the culture, not a rule, not a directive, just the accumulated weight of 11 years of professional behavior that said, you're here to do a job, and your life outside that job is your own business, and the correct way to handle difficulty is to handle it quietly, privately, without requiring anyone to adjust for you. He had believed this. He still mostly believed this. But actually, Charlotte's question had introduced a crack in it, because she had asked, and he had felt something in the moment she asked that he had not felt from any of the systems theoretically designed to catch what she had caught. He had felt for approximately 45 seconds in a corridor that his state was visible and that someone was offering him the acknowledgement of it without requiring anything in return. Margaret Hollis, when she eventually spoke to him, and she did at the end of the 6 weeks in a room with good light and 2 cups of tea, didn't ask him what he was feeling. She asked him what he needed. The distinction was deliberate. He noticed it immediately. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about his mother. He told her in the careful, abridged way that private people tell private things to institutional representatives. Factual, logistical, stripped of anything that might read as complaint. His mother was unwell, which he had increased his hours to manage costs. He was managing. He would continue to manage. He wasn't asking for anything. Margaret Hollis listened to all of it. Then she said, what if there was something to ask for? He didn't know what that meant, practically. And that, she told him, was the problem they were actually trying to solve. Because the support existed. On paper, in policy documents that have been approved and filed and technically distributed. Employee assistance programs. Plus, flexible scheduling provision. Welfare consultation access. All of it existed. And none of, well, it had reached Daniel Osei, not because anyone had actively withheld it, but because nobody had told him it was there in any way that made it feel real or available or meant for someone in his exact position. The gap between the policy and the person wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. It was the ordinary gap that exists in most institutions between the thing that's officially provided and the thing that people actually feel permitted to access. Charlotte had fallen into that gap. Not literally, but her question had landed in it, which had illuminated it with the uncomplicated directness of a child who had not yet learned that some things are technically available, but culturally inaccessible. The review that Margaret Hollis submitted was 42 pages. It was addressed to the relevant senior figures within the household, and it contained, in carefully measured institutional language, a clear account basically of what the system showed and what the reality reflected and where the distance between them lived and why. To be fair, it contained recommendations. 11 of them. They were specific. They were costed. They were, in the opinion of people qualified to have opinions on these things, achievable. It didn't mention, Charlotte by name. It didn't need to. Everyone who read it knew where it had started. There's a particular strange quality to being the reason something changes without being part of the change itself. Charlotte didn't attend any meetings. She didn't know about the review. She was 8 years old, and she was doing the things that 8-year-olds do, and Somewhere in the building around her, a 42-page document was moving through the layers of an institution because she had tilted her head in a corridor and waited for an honest answer. On a Tuesday, in the, to be fair, rain outside, though inside it was dry. The response to the review came in stages. The first stage was the response that always comes first, which is careful acknowledgement. The language of taking things seriously, of appreciating the thoroughness, of committing to consideration. Anyone who has ever submitted a report to a large institution knows this stage and knows not to mistake it for action. The second stage took longer, but it came. Within the royal household, certain things shifted. They didn't, to be fair, shift loudly or publicly. This is not an institution that announces its internal adjustments with press releases. But the scheduling protocols were reviewed. The communication channels between welfare resources and front-facing staff were looked at practically and basically by people who were given clear instructions to close the gap rather than document it. Supervisors received updated guidance on the signs of staff welfare needs. Guidance that was different from what had existed before in one crucial way. It was written in language that assumed people wouldn't volunteer information and instructed supervisors to ask directly in the way that expects a real answer. Daniel O'Say, in the months following the review, was connected with resources that had always theoretically been available to him. The practical support for his mother's care situation, the scheduling flexibility that allowed him to be present for the appointments and the decisions and the long hours that caring for an unwell parent requires. Not everything was solved. Some things cannot be solved, only held, only managed, but the weight redistributed slightly. Enough to notice, he told Margaret Hollis in a follow-up conversation that wasn't part of any formal process, but happened because she was the kind of person who circles back, that he felt different in the building now. Not dramatically, not in any way he could fully articulate. Just seen, he said, which was the word he used. The same word, essentially, that he had felt in the corridor. She wrote it down, not for any report, just for herself, because the word a person uses when they describe the thing that changed for them is usually the most important data in the whole investigation. Seen. That was it. That was what Charlotte had done without knowing she was doing it, without knowing it would travel through 3 pages of written testimony. A 6-week review and 42 pages of formal findings and 11 recommendations and an institution quietly reorganizing itself around a gap it had not admitted to having. Well, she had seen him for 45 seconds, which in a corridor, and the palace, which is very good at managing information and very practiced at keeping the world at a careful distance from the truth of what happens inside it, had read his account of those 45 seconds and understood that it was being asked a question too. Not by the guard, by a child who had no idea that she was asking anything. The question was simple. The same question she had asked Daniel O'Say. Honestly, slightly different wording. Same intention. Are you okay? Plus, in the palace, like Daniel O'Say, had hesitated before it answered. And the hesitation, like his hesitation, was the answer. The work of the second stage continued. It was ongoing, and it would be ongoing for some time because the gap that exists between a policy and a person is not closed with a document. It is closed gradually through the accumulation of small practical changes and cultural adjustments and the persistent, unglamorous work of making official things feel real to the people they're supposed to reach. Margaret Hollis understood this. She had spent 23 years watching institutions do the easier thing, which is to write the policy, and the harder thing, which is to make the policy live. She had submitted 42 pages. She had 11 recommendations. She had one word from a man in a corridor that she had written in her private notes, and not her formal report. And to be fair, she had the knowledge, which she couldn't formally document, but which she carried clearly, that none of this would have been set in motion without an 8-year-old who had looked at someone's face and decided that the polite answer and the true answer weren't the same thing. That the polite answer wasn't good enough. That the, real answer was worth stopping for. Months passed. The kind of months that don't announce themselves. Not the dramatic ones, not the ones that mark before and after in a person's life. Just months. Work and sleep and the slow business of holding things together. Daniel Osei stood in corridors. He stood in other corridors now too. His rotation had been adjusted, which was one of the small practical changes that had come out of the review, the kind of adjustment that sounds minor on paper and is not minor at all if you're the person whose schedule it is. Variety, it turns out, matters, and being seen in different spaces by different people. Not pretty much being so fixed in one position for so many hours that you become, to yourself and to those around you, part of the architecture. His mother was doing better. Not well. The word well was still too ambitious, still something to be held at a careful distance, and not pushed toward, but better, stable, present in her apartment in a way she had not been the previous autumn, more like herself, more able to sit at the table in the afternoon, drink tea, and complain about British weather, which Daniel took as a good sign because complaining about British weather was, for her, a form of home. He, I think, didn't think about Charlotte every day. He didn't think about the corridor every day, but the memory of it was therein, the way that certain memories are there, not accessed directly, but always a few steps away, available when needed, like a tool that lives in a drawer you pass regularly. He had been asked by someone in an official capacity if he wished to remain anonymous in relation to the review. He had said yes. He didn't want to be a story. He had not told his story to become one. He had, I think, told it because he was asked, and because being asked by a person in an official capacity with a pen, and in my opinion, form and the careful language of institutional accountability had done something that he couldn't have predicted. It, to be fair, had made the thing real. It had taken what happened, the corridor, the child, the 45 seconds, and placed it in the category of things that happened. Things that counted. Things that weren't going to dissolve back into the texture of an ordinary Tuesday. He had felt, when he submitted the written account, that he was doing his job, completing a required task. Professional, precise, without embellishment. Plus, he had not expected it to feel like putting something down, like setting a weight on a table and stepping back and looking at it outside of your own body for the first time. Here it is. This is what I was carrying. This is what it looked like on my face. To be fair, a child saw it. I wrote it down. Now it exists in a room somewhere in 3 pages of careful testimony. And that's more solid than anything I'd before, which was just the weight itself, which I'd been carrying in the place that has no name, just behind the eyes. Inside the palace. The 11 recommendations from Margaret Hollis's review were moving through the institution at the pace that institutional change moves, which is not fast, but is, when it is genuine, inexorable. The recommendations have been tiered by the people responsible for implementing them. Those which could be addressed immediately, those which required structural adjustment over time, those which were really about culture rather than policy, and would therefore take the longest and require the most sustained attention. The immediate ones were addressed first. The actually welfare resource communication gap. The distance between what existed on paper and what staff understood to be available to them in practice was tackled through a series of changes that were direct and small, and in the way that direct and small things often are more effective than the larger and more complex interventions that surrounded them. A dedicated person, one person whose job was explicitly this and not this among 12 other things, was assigned to the welfare function for household staff. Not a hotline. Not a portal. A person, I think, with a name, with an office, with regular availability that was communicated directly and repeatedly until it became known. The difference between a policy and a person is that a policy cannot look at your face. A person can. That was the lesson that Charlotte had taught, without meaning to teach anything. The institution had been careful enough and old enough and, in this instance, humble enough to learn it. The cultural work was harder. It always is. You sort of cannot recommend your way out of culture. You can write 11 things on 42 pages, and every one of them can be right and reasonable and thoroughly evidenced. And still the culture will be there in the morning, in the hesitation before the answer, In the 11 years of accumulated understanding that the correct way to handle difficulty is to handle it quietly, privately, without requiring anyone to adjust. Margaret Hollis knew this. She had known it before she began. The honestly, culture work wasn't going to be resolved in one review cycle or 2 or 5. It was going to be worked at year over year through the smallest possible unit of change, which is a person deciding once to say the real thing instead of the easy thing. And then again, and one yes instead of fine, one stopped walk instead of a continued one, one tilted head, one real question, one 45-second pause in a corridor. The institution had looked at its own account and found in it a portrait of itself that it didn't entirely recognize and didn't entirely disavow. This was the most honest response available to it. Institutions are not people. They don't feel guilt in the clean way that people feel guilt. They feel it translated through the language of review and recommendation and structural adjustment, through the decision to assign a person rather than a hotline, through the scheduling change and the follow-up conversation and the word that Margaret Hollis wrote in her private notes and not her formal report. Seen on the floor well of Parliament, none of this existed. In the newspapers, none of this existed. It had not become, at any point, a public story. The palace had managed this with the competence that it brings to all such things, which is to say it had not needed to manage it so much as declined to confirm what no one had formally claimed. There were no leaks. Nobody sold anything. The people involved understood the nature of the space they worked in, and the princess was 8 years old and didn't know there was anything to manage. This is the strange truth that sits at the center of the whole story. The thing that generated 42 pages and 11 recommendations and months of institutional adjustment and a word written in private notes. That thing was performed by a child who was simply walking through a corridor and noticed something and stopped. She didn't know. She will know eventually, probably, not the details. The details are not hers to know and are not anyone's to share. But the shape of what she did, the way that noticing a person and asking them a real question and waiting for the honest answer instead of the polite one is a skill and a practice and a thing that can be carried into the world and used. Can be used, in corridors and in boardrooms and at kitchen tables and in the long afternoons of a family member's slow decline. Can be used anywhere that a human face is showing something that the human face's owner has not yet said out loud. She will know the shape of it. Plus, she, in my opinion, already knows it. She's always known it by some combination of her nature and the people who raised her and the particular way she came into the world. She will simply know one day that the shape has a history, that she used it once without knowing she was using it in a corridor on a Tuesday when she was 8. Daniel Osei learned, eventually and indirectly, that his account had contributed to something larger. TBH, not the specifics. The specifics weren't for him, which was appropriate and also, in some way, quietly correct. What he learned was that the review had led to changes, that the recommendations were being implemented, that the word he had used in a follow-up conversation with a woman named Margaret Hollis had been heard. He sort of thought about this on the walk home one evening in the rain with his hands in his pockets. He basically thought about the fact that he had spent 11 years in those corridors, had never, not once, felt that his interior life was relevant to the institution he served. Not because, to be fair, anyone had said so, just because of the accumulated weight of professional culture, the sense that the job is the job, and you're here to do it, and the rest of you live somewhere else. And then a child had stopped. Plus, and the rest of him had been here after all. Visible, present, on his face all along. Plus, and the institution, which is old and careful and managed and very good at the language of taking things seriously, had done something he had not expected it to do. It, in my opinion, had actually taken it seriously. It had looked at his account, 3 pages, a Tuesday, 45 seconds. It had seen in those 3 pages not a problem to be managed, but a question to be answered. Are you okay? Plus, not the diplomatic version, the real version, the version that waits. Margaret Hollis retired the following spring. This wasn't related to the review. She had been planning it for 2 years, had told her husband in January of the previous year that she thought this would be her last. She left with the quiet thoroughness that characterized everything she did. Her files were organized, and her notes were archived. Her successor was prepared, and in her private archive, in a notebook she kept for the things that didn't belong in official reports, there was a word. On a page by itself. The way she sometimes recorded things that were the real answer to a question her professional role had required her to ask in formal language. Scene. She closed the notebook. She left the building. Outside, London continued to do what it does. Weather and movement and the dense, ordinary texture of 10 million lives being lived simultaneously in the same general space. She walked to the car. She thought about her garden, which needed attention. Thought about her husband, who was making dinner. She thought about the child in the corridor, not with sentiment, with something more precise than sentiment, with the particular feeling that comes when you have spent a career in an institution and you have watched it miss the things it was supposed to catch and seen it document what it couldn't fix and manage the gap between the ideal version of itself and the actual version with 42 pages and 11 recommendations. And then you find at the end that the thing which cracked it open wasn't a scandal or a report or a whistleblower or a parliamentary inquiry. It was a child who walked through a corridor, who noticed, who stopped, look who asked, and waited. That is the whole story. And it is a true one, not in the sense that every detail can be confirmed against a public record. Those records don't exist, and they were never going to. It is true in the sense that matters more than documentation. In the sense, honestly, that anyone who has worked in a large institution will recognize the texture of it. The gap between the policy and the person, the hesitation before the fine, which the 11 years of carrying something that was never given a name and therefore couldn't be asked for, and the 8-year-old who looked at a face and saw the thing that had no name and named it, plus with a question, with a pause, with, in my opinion, the simplest and most radical thing a person can offer another person, which is the full weight of their attention and the clear signal that the real answer is wanted. The corridors of Windsor Castle continue to smell of old wood and lemon polish. Guards continue to stand in their positions. Children continue to walk through in the loose, dreamy way of children who think nobody important is watching. Except now, there's a person with a name and an office and a door that's actually open. And the scheduling is better. And the word scene is in a notebook in a woman's private archive. And that's not nothing. That is in fact everything.